In 1945, a German woman named Erna Bielhardt was arrested by Soviet soldiers on charges that she had been a concentration camp supervisor. The place in question was Stutthof, one of the cruelest detention centers of the Third Reich, where thousands of people suffered indescribable pain and met their end. The following year, Bielhardt, along with other women who also held various positions in the field, were brought to trial to determine her degree of responsibility. As witnesses filed past and gave their version of events, the public was stunned. It seemed incredible that women so young and harmless-looking should have committed crimes so savage that they would chill the blood of the most reckless. However, Bielhardt stressed over and over again that she had nothing to do with the crimes, that she had never hit anyone, much less murdered prisoners. In fact, according to her, she was just as shocked as the rest of the room to hear about the torture. Camp survivors confirmed these facts, although the court was not entirely convinced. For Bielhardt, it was a matter of life and death. Within a few hours, the judges would decide the fate of each defendant, and would make it known whether he was to be hanged or imprisoned. Do not move from your screen, because in the next few minutes we will tell you everything about the trial of the Stutthof guards. The Stutthof concentration camp was the first to be established outside the borders of Germany during World War II. It was built in Poland, in a region far from large urban centers, surrounded by swamps and forests. It officially opened its doors in September 1939, and in its beginnings it was thought of as a place to house the most important members of Polish society. The prisoners came from the economic, political, and cultural elite of the country, so that political leaders, religious leaders, famous artists, and highly prestigious intellectuals lived in their barracks. A year before its inauguration, the Nazis had drawn up lists of Poles considered dangerous who had to be arrested immediately. The underlying objective was to reorganize the country in the image and likeness of National Socialist ideals, and the first step for this was to eliminate these subjects. Although Stutthof was supposed to house civilians, as a consequence of the war the Nazis also sent prisoners of war there. Within weeks of opening, there were already 6,000 people locked up, and the number grew as Germany deported Jews from conquered territories. The site had 40 subcamps, whose inmates were forced to do forced labor to supply the German military industry. Most of the slave workers had to attend a weapons factory daily to help in the production of war material. As in any concentration camp, the living conditions in Stutthof were deplorable. Over the years that it worked, an estimated 110,000 people passed through it. More than half of that total died from the spread of diseases such as typhus, or from lack of basic food. Those who were weakened by hunger were selected by the guards to die in the gas chambers, since they were not fit for forced tasks. Most of those executed in this way were Jewish women and children, who spent their last seconds of life inhaling the Zyklon B poison. Among all the crimes that occurred inside the Stutthof, perhaps the most chilling is the rumor that the SS used the corpses to extract their body fat and make soaps. Although this was never fully confirmed, it has been proven that the Nazis in the camp subjected the inmates to terrible torture. At the beginning of 1945, when the Third Reich was on the verge of defeat, the leaders of Stutthof organized the evacuation of the camp. Thousands of exhausted, starving and sick prisoners were forced to walk hundreds of miles to get away from the Allies. According to specialists, 25,000 people died in this process. When the Soviets liberated the camp on May 9, 1945, they found no more than 100 survivors, those who hid from the Nazis to avoid forced marches. Following the surrender of Germany, the Allies rounded up what few Stutthof personnel they could find. There were 72 SS officers and 6 female supervisors. In 1946 the trial began, and the survivors declared the torture to which they had been subjected by the Nazi women. They were Jenny Barkmann, Elizabeth Becker, Wanda Klaff, Eva Paradis, Gerda Steinhardt and Erna Bielhardt, who we told you about at the beginning of the video. Those who witnessed the sessions later stated that the defendants did not seem interested in what was said about them. In fact, Barkmann was seen absently fixing her hair, smiling and flirting with the guards who were watching her. The only one who was nervous was Erna Bielhardt, who said the following: I was affiliated with the National Socialist Party since 1933. I liked the Führer's idea that we would be a dominant nation, but I never liked my job. The prisoners were tormented too much. I had to look the other way. In fact, she resigned 6 weeks after being appointed camp supervisor, after which she dedicated herself to tending wounded soldiers. After much doubt, the judges decided to spare her life and sentence her to 5 years in prison. The case of the other women, however, was very different, since the witnesses assured that they were in charge of selecting those who would die in the gas chambers. One of them, Wanda Claff, proudly acknowledged it. "I am very intelligent and I have always been brilliant in my work. I beat at least 2 prisoners a day." One survivor stated the following about defendant Ava Paradis: "Once, she ordered a group of inmates to strip naked in the middle of the snow, and she showered us with ice-cold water. If any of them moved, she would beat us up." The evidence was abundant and the brutality evident, so the court sentenced the 5 Stutthof supervisors to death by hanging. The date of the executions was set for July 4, 1946, and the place chosen was a hill near the city of Gdansk, in Poland. That day, a crowd of 20,000 people gathered to witness the death of the monsters that had caused so much pain. A scaffold was not set up, but it was decided to put a rope around their necks, pass it through a post and tie it to the back of a truck. Once the vehicle moved forward, the women would remain slightly suspended in the air for the minutes necessary for them to be strangled to death. The first executed was Jenny Barkman, whose last words were these: "Life is a pleasure, and that is why it ends quickly." The audience watched as her body rose, the knot wrapped around her throat, her feet pounding in a frantic rhythm. When she stood still, it was the turn of the others, who passed one by one towards their final destination. The bodies were left hanging there, so that the next convicts would have a clear view of what awaited them. Not only the 5 women from Stutthof were killed, but also 6 other male guards who had tortured prisoners. This is how the victims of the concentration camp found some justice for the horrors to which they were subjected by Nazism. We have reached the end of the video and we want to ask you, do you think Erna Bielhart should have been executed? In April 1945, the BBC broadcast a report that chilled the blood of television viewers. The story in question had its origin in Germany, in the Bergen-Belsen concentration camp, which was one of the most important of the Third Reich. Journalists had recorded the moment when Allied troops arrived at the site and found thousands of bodies piled up on the ground, unburied, rotting in the open. In a quavering voice, the BBC announcer described the scene as follows: "Here, on this piece of land, lie the dead and dying, the living resting their heads on the corpses. Among them move emaciated people who look like ghosts, who haven't eaten for months, walking aimlessly, with their eyes lost on the horizon. Babies were born in this place, but these poor creatures had no chance of surviving in these conditions. A maddened mother yelled at our English soldiers to give her a bottle of milk for her child, but the child in question had been dead for days in his crib." Rarely had the British population encountered such horror. Immediately, they began to wonder who was responsible for this barbarity and when they would have to pay the consequences. The answer to these questions came a few months later, when the Allies arrested Bergen-Belsen's commanding personnel and put them on trial. It was then that the truth came out: many of the murders had been committed by young women affiliated with Nazism. Beneath the apparent innocence of his youth, lurked monsters capable of subjecting prisoners to hell. Do not move from your screen, because in the next few minutes we'll tell you the story of these women and the punishment they received for their crimes. The Bergen-Belsen camp opened its doors in 1940 in northern Germany, and in its beginnings it was designed to contain prisoners of war from the Allied countries. However, shortly after the SS took control of the site and decided to modify its functions. From this moment on, it began to house Jews, political opponents of Nazism, Gypsies, and Slavs. Inside the camp, the different groups were divided according to their origin, so that the Jews were separated into one camp for those who came from Poland, another for those from the Netherlands, and another for those of Hungarian descent. The same criteria was used to divide the other communities. As in all concentration centers, the inmates were forced to perform forced labor to help German industry. In the case of Bergen-Belsen, they had to work as slaves in a leather recycling factory, where each person was given shoes from which the reusable material had to be removed. In August 1944, the establishment began to receive women. Thousands of young people, adults, and old women were confined inside, and it is known that Anne Frank found her end here. The female population of the camp was subjected to the same deplorable conditions as the male. Most of the problems were caused by overcrowding. Bergen-Belsen was full, and there was no room to accommodate more people. This, however, was not an inconvenience for the Nazi hierarchs, who did not care about the comfort of the prisoners and even enjoyed seeing them suffer. Soon the food available to the inmates ran out, and those who did not die of malnutrition were stricken with terrible diseases. Dysentery, typhus, and tuberculosis spread among the prisoners and decimated their numbers. Faced with the catastrophe, the reaction of the Nazi guards was to execute the inmates, with the aim of eliminating the human surplus and restoring balance. In April 1945, with Nazi Germany almost defeated, British troops arrived at the Bergen-Belsen camp. As we told you at the beginning of the video, when they entered they found 13,000 unburied bodies and 60,000 inmates starving and on the verge of death. The staff who managed the establishment were arrested and taken into custody until, 5 months later, the trial began to determine who had been guilty of the crimes committed there. Beginning in September 1945, dozens of SS members were questioned by prosecutors. Those who witnessed the event were shocked to see that those responsible for a large part of the crimes were young women. One of them was Irma Gries, just 22 years old, who had earned the nicknames the Beast of Belsen and the Hyena of Auschwitz. Gries had worked as a prison guard in several concentration camps, and in all of them she displayed the same sociopathic behavior. She was personally in charge of choosing those destined for the gas chambers, and on occasion she beat defenseless inmates to death with her bare hands. One of her favorite pastimes was to unleash hungry dogs on her victims, who were torn to pieces by the animals. Another of Bergen-Belsen's prominent torturers was Elisabeth Volkenrath, 26, who had commanded the women's section of Auschwitz in her record. She liked to play with the lives of the prisoners, whom she subjected to torture, beatings, and executions. According to certain witnesses, she had gone so far as to kill an old woman by pushing her down a staircase. Among the defendants in the trial, there was also Johanna Bormann, known as the Woman of the Dogs, since she shared the same passion as Irma Gries for letting the inmates be devoured by her dogs. The jury ruled that the crimes were so heinous that they deserved the death penalty. 10 other SS guards, however, were sentenced to prison, as there was insufficient evidence against them. On December 13, 1945, the scaffold was prepared for Gries, Volkenrath, and Bormann to take their last steps. The person in charge of the execution was Albert Pierrepoint, a professional executioner who had the habit of interviewing the sentenced and taking their body measurements, to calculate the exact length of the rope that was to hang them. In his memoirs, Pierrepoint gives details of what the meeting with each of the women was like. Her brief moment with Irma Gries went as follows. When we opened her cell, she came up to us laughing. She looked like the type of girl you want to date. She answered all the questions I asked her, but when I wanted to know how old she was, she kept quiet and looked at me with a knowing smile. At that moment I realized that asking a woman how old she is was awkward and impolite, although she finally answered. After taking her measurements, at 9:34 in the morning, she entered the execution room and walked to the center of her scaffold. There was a chalk mark indicating where she should stand. We put a white hood over her head and wound the noose around her neck. The last thing Irma said was schnell, which in German means fast. The trap opened and within a few minutes, the doctor pronounced her dead. 30 minutes later it was the turn of Elisabeth Volkenrath, who until the last minute denied having participated in the crimes of Bergen-Belsen or having any knowledge of the Holocaust. At 10:04 in the morning the gallows did their duty and broke Volkenrath's neck. Half an hour later, the guards led Johanna Bormann to her scaffold. The woman was 52 years old and her health was failing, as she limped noticeably. The last thing she said before she died was, "I have feelings too." This is how the story of these women came to an end, who went down in history as the cruelest of the Third Reich. Although the victims could in no way be compensated for their suffering, the sentences served to show them that there was still justice in the world. We have reached the end of the video. Leave us your comment and don't forget to subscribe to our channel to learn about many more military events that left their mark on history.